So, my name's Ian. Those of you that don't know me, I'm an electrician. I've done it later in life, recently qualified last year. The company that I work for, we do mostly solar, battery, setting up people with power who live up in the bush and they don't have power poles up to their house, so we go up into the middle of nowhere and set people up with power. And a job we were doing recently, we were installing a big, what's called a ground mount array. So not solar panels on a roof, they were in a paddock, and we built a frame and we put them on the frame. You might have seen them sometimes. Anyway, this is quite a long array that we built, so there's lots of posts got to go on the ground. And that involves getting an excavator with a rammer to come in, and we ram the posts into the ground. And this particular location is very rocky and the post's not quite going in perfectly, so you've got to ram it pretty hard. And so part of that job ends up being you got to put this frame on the posts later. So the posts have got to be nice and plumb and flush, and you got to get it nice and neat. So that involves using an angle grinder, grinding it down. So there's a few of us on this job. We're grinding it down. We've got earmuffs on. We've got safety goggles on. We're focused on what we're doing, grinding down these posts. But like I said, we're in a paddock and it's fairly dry and it's recently been slashed. And as I say it sounds obvious what could happen. But you know, we do these things all the time. We do safety checks, but sometimes these things catch up with you because you do them all the time and it eludes you at the moment. And so a few of us are working on these posts, we're grinding them down, focused on what we're doing. And then someone runs down the hill and points behind us and there's flames. There's fire in the grass coming up towards us, and thankfully, we're so tunnel vision on what we're doing, we're blind to what's going on behind us. Fire could have come at the back of our legs. We got flammable liquids right near us. Could have been horrible. Could have been bad. It was all put out safely. No one was hurt. We got the fire put out. But I say it to make the point that we were blind to what was going on. We're so focused on what we're doing that we're blind to the bigger picture and the immediate danger and the context of what's going on. And so as we look at the passage, or at the whole chapter really, but mainly this passage towards the end of John chapter 9, this is what I see, this theme. And the theme that stuck out to me was the idea of can't see the forest for the trees. So this idiom of the idea of being too focused on the detail that you're not seeing the big picture. And so that's informed the way I've structured what I have to say this morning. And the way I see it in this chapter, we have two groups of people. We have people who are blind and we have people who can see. And so I'm going to break up what I have to say into two parts this morning. The first being how you can miss the point of Jesus, and the second being how you can get the point of Jesus. So, how to miss the point of Jesus. Now, I don't want people to miss the point of Jesus, but I think we can see some great examples in this passage of things you can do if you want to take the wrong turn. And to be fair, we're all guilty of, at times, I know I haven't always been a Christian, and there were times where I wasn't doing everything I could to get the point of Jesus. I was guilty of some of these things we're going to look at today. So, firstly, we see in this story this amazing restoration happens with this man who's born blind. He's a beggar on the side of the road. He's blind his whole life. He would have no reason to think that his sight was going to be restored. He would have very little hope, and most people would have seen him as a lost cause. But Jesus didn't see him as a lost cause, and he uses this man who didn't even ask him to reveal who he was to all these people around and to us through his word. Even the man says in the passage that we heard from Cherry was, who's ever heard of a man born blind being made to see? This is an incredible thing. And so it begs the question, what's the response? What do you do when you hear something amazing? I'm a fan of AFL footy. I follow the Geelong Cats. My grandparents emigrated from England to Geelong, and my whole dad's family, none of us got a choice. We went for Geelong, and when I was a kid, that was not so fun. But it's been more enjoyable later in life, which I'm thankful for. But I really enjoy the footy. There's been times where I've been really into it, and times where I don't follow it as much. And I've come to realise if you want to understand the footy and you want to get it, you either got to watch all the games or you got to be there. You've got to be hearing it directly. You've got to be hearing it from the source. And so you'd think this might be the strategy of the Pharisees. Let's go hear what Jesus has to say. Let's go hear it. He did this amazing thing. How did you do it? Let's go ask him. But that's not what happens. And this is the first point I want to bring up. How you can miss the point of Jesus. If I get my next slide. Oh, I've done what I said I wouldn't do. There we go. So number one, don't listen directly to Jesus directly. And this is what the Pharisees are doing. They bring this man who is born blind, and they ask him all the questions. And they ask him, who's this Jesus? What's going on? How did he do it? And they don't like the answers they're hearing. It's easier to try and understand who Jesus is, if we just seek someone we already agree with. I know when in my early days even before I became a Christian, it was easier just to look to someone I already agreed with who'd speak about Jesus and just hear their point of view. He's a compassionate man. He's a loving man. The easy things to accept. And that's true. He is a loving and compassionate man. Was and is. But there's so much more. And I think deep down we know that if we listen directly, we deal directly with Jesus and what he has to say, it's going to change our lives. Lives are going to be flipped upside down. We see here we're going to be restored. And we see this on many occasions in the New Testament. And we see this also in the man who was born blind. He's had his eyesight restored. And, if that happened to you, he's had this physical restoration, the physical encounter with Jesus. It's an amazing thing. I don't think he's going to have anything bad to say about him. And that's what we see when he encounters the Pharisees, who are people of authority and somewhat intimidating and need to be respectful. But he doesn't back down. He presents what he saw and what he thinks of Jesus to these people who don't want him to be what they're saying. And we see this from verse 30, where this says from... there we go. No. John 9, verse 30. The man answered, "Why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshipper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." And they answered him, "You were born in utter sin, and you would teach us." And they cast him out. See, it's not just the miracle of a man's eyesight being restored that matters in this situation. What matters is who Jesus is. And this man points this out, that Jesus must have some connection to God. He must be more than what they think he is, or even who he thinks he is in some way. But we see what their Pharisees' response is just, how did he hear? He's a sinner. How did he restore your eyesight? And this is the second point of how you can miss the point of Jesus, and that is to focus on the irrelevant. They're not dealing with the meat on the bone of who Jesus is, really. They're just gnawing around the edges and trying to find something simple to say, okay, this man's a sinner, don't have to listen to him. Like many of us, I use YouTube, find it a great resource. It's also a great distraction. There's a lot of great content. I find that, particularly now, these websites all have algorithms and they steer you in a certain direction with what they're showing you. I find mine turns into political and religious and philosophical content, especially at night, which is a bit weird. I don't know. I feel like there's a bit of an agenda there or something. I don't know. It's a bit weird. But there's some great Christian content, and other content that's not Christian as well. But I've always noticed, even from my early days of being Christian, that there's this agnostic, atheist type content that's always trying to sow little seeds of doubt. And the angles they're coming out to argue against Christianity, it's always this kind of strategy of focusing on the irrelevant. They're not dealing with the resurrection. They're not dealing with Jesus' claim of deity and his miracles. They're dealing with these fringe issues. One that used to come up all the time that in my early days kind of rocked me a little bit was like, what about the Gospel of Thomas? Here's this gospel that, why isn't it part of the Bible? And it's like, and it paints a bit of a different picture of who Jesus is. And I'd go, maybe I'm not got that right. And that's all it is. You don't think past that point. You just sort of go, okay, maybe I haven't got that right. But it turns out that's a Gnostic gospel, and there's a reason why that's not included in the text. There's good reason for that. But that's the strategy, isn't it? That it's not trying to deal with the real meat of what Jesus is about. It's ignoring the main issues, focusing on the irrelevant. See if you can dismiss Jesus easily, make people have a doubt, and just move along. That's what the Pharisees are trying to do here. Just easily dismiss him. And this is closely connected to the third way we miss the point of Jesus. And that is to dismiss those that get Jesus as unimportant. And this, we see in that passage I just reread, that they say he was born in utter sin, and you would teach us, and they cast him out. And they're pressing him for his testimony, and he's giving it. That's all he's doing. He's not trying to offend them. He's being brave. And their response is to belittle him. And this behaviour is consistent with the pattern we see in this chapter. We have a man who's born blind and his eyesight's restored. And as the chapter goes on, his spiritual sight increases. He was restored physically in that moment, but then he begins to see who Jesus is. And by the end of the chapter, we see he truly sees who Jesus is. And that's the opposite of the Pharisees. They're just finding ways to look away. They're finding ways to not try and see who Jesus is. And it's across the whole book of John as well. If we think back to chapter 3, which we heard from a month or so ago, with meeting with Nicodemus at night, this is a reasonable response. At the early part of the book of John, they've gone from hearing out Jesus to some extent to now don't even want to speak to him, don't even want to try and engage with who he is and what he's about. And because they're threatened by losing their pride and their position and who they are, and it's easier to put Jesus to death than to acknowledge that they may be wrong about him. So it eventually gets to that point, as we'll see as we go through John for the rest of our time leading up to Easter. And one of the ways this pride manifests itself into this situation is through the belittling and dismissing of people who believe in Jesus and those who do understand him. In John chapter 7, there's another example of this. Hope that's big enough to read. Verse 40, when they heard these words, some of the people said, this really is the prophet. Others, Jesus had just spoken at this point. Verse 41, others said, this is the Christ. But some said, is the Christ to come from Galilee? Has not the scripture said that the Christ comes from the offspring of David and comes from Bethlehem, the village where David was? So there was a division among the people over him. Some of them wanted to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him. The officers came to the chief priests and Pharisees, who said to them, why did you not bring him? The officers said, no one ever spoke like this man. The Pharisees answered him, have you also been deceived? Have any of the authorities or Pharisees believed in him? But this crowd does not know that the law is accursed. Nicodemus, who had gone to him before and who was one of them, said to them, does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing or learning what he does? They replied, are you from Galilee too? Search and see that no prophet arises from Galilee. And so this is Nicodemus from chapter 3 who had met with him, has the reasonable response of like, why don't we hear him out? This is exactly what they should do. And their response, is this thing that we can do if we want to miss Jesus. We're going to belittle him. Reduce him to this idea of dismissing by just belittling someone, And I remember my early days it was actually before I became a Christian, I would listen to atheists and Christian debates, or, you see episodes of Q&A where they have a Christian guest. And even as a non-Christian at the time, I found it so disappointing, the behaviour of the non-Christian, the atheist arguing against Christian, because it was often this strategy of just belittle the Christian, belittle the conservative, because they know it scores a cheap little score against them, makes them look a bit silly. Oh, well then they're wrong. Because most people are just waiting for someone to say, you don't have to worry about this Jesus thing, you don't have to turn your life upside down. It's all right, don't worry about it. They want to hear that. And so that's the strategy is, make them sound unimportant, reduce these people to less than, but don't really engage with what's being said. And so this is a key way we're going to miss the point of Jesus. So that's enough missing the point of Jesus. How do we get the point of Jesus? And it's not really too far away from what we've already looked at, in that we're going to flip it around. Where we don't listen to Jesus directly, we're going to listen to Jesus directly. If we come back to verse 45 for a moment, the officers then came to the chief priests and Pharisees, who said to them, why did you not bring him? The officers answered, no one ever spoke like this man. I'll go back for a second. spoke like this man. The Pharisees answered them, "Have you also been deceived?" When those officers woke up that morning, I'm sure they expected to just do their job. They would have, if they were asked to arrest somebody by the appropriate authorities, they would have done it. But we see in this passage that they heard Jesus. They heard him for themselves, and they're changed. They don't arrest Jesus. They don't bring him back. They even say to them, like, "There's no one spoke like this man. Who is this?" And that's what we see. If we listen to Jesus directly, we're going to be changed. I know for myself that even though before I became Christian, I grew up in a non-Christian home, but my parents, they made me and my sister read the Gospel of Luke because, well, they were teachers, and they knew the literary importance of Christianity, and so I had some familiarity about who Jesus was to some extent. But it's not until you read it for yourself, and not until I came to church and heard someone passionately speak about who Jesus is, someone who understands it and gets who Jesus is beyond just the surface level, that you really can be changed. So if you're listening to him directly, it's going to change you. And we see this also throughout the Gospels in other stories. Again, thinking back to John chapter 4, which we heard about recently as well, the Samaritan woman at the well, who this woman was an outcast getting water in the middle of the day. No one was that associated with her, and yet she's changed when she encounters Jesus and speaks with him. She goes back and tells everyone in her town all about it. She's changed. So listening to Jesus directly, we do that, we're well on our way to understanding who he is. So the second way that we're going to get Jesus is not focusing on the irrelevant. We're going to focus on what matters. As I've already touched on, we see the blind man's spiritual sight increase and the Pharisees' spiritual sight decrease. But you could also, it's conceivable that the man who was born blind, he could have been convinced by the Pharisees, who, like we say, are somewhat intimidating. They're people of authority. Maybe they could have convinced him in that moment that Jesus isn't who he thinks he is. Maybe he healed my sight, but maybe you're right, he's not God. Maybe that could have been what the man's response was. Now, he was obviously, he did have his eyesight restored. He has a lot of reason to believe Jesus is who he is, but we see this man, he doesn't back down, and he's focused on what matters. He sees straight. He's obviously been given this glimpse into who Jesus is, and he's seen too much. He can't just turn around and be convinced otherwise through these cheap strategies about trying to dismiss him. He's focused on who Jesus is, and he argues for it to people who he should have every reason to be somewhat intimidated by. And that's what matters in following Jesus and understanding who he is. I believe not getting bogged down in theological detail and arguing about history, or even keeping focus on the surface level of irrelevant facts. It's focusing on the fact that he died and paid the price for everyone, that we can all find purpose, meaning, and everlasting life in him. And that's what I think is so great about home group, Bible study, or whatever you call it, or even events we've had in the past at the Albert Hall, or we've got churches together and we have worship before we start whatever it is we're doing. It's just that great atmosphere where we're all focused and at one together, worshipping God for who he is and what he did with Jesus. We're not worried about who slightly disagrees with who or whatever. We're focused on what Jesus did and why. And by keeping focused on what matters, that we're getting who Jesus is. Now, the third point of how to get the point of Jesus. Now, I'm a bit of a Jordan Peterson fan. I really enjoyed 12 Rules for Life, his book, back when it first came. And I don't keep up with him so much today, but and I'll be honest, he's not a Christian. I don't look into him for my theological advice, my Christian advice, but that book is a fantastic book, and there's some great chapters in there, some great points. And one of them was just the perfect antidote to this idea of dismissing those that do get Jesus as important. That's chapter 9 in the book of 12 Rules for Life. And that is, assume that anyone that you meet might know something you don't. Now, this is not an easy thing to do. It's not too hard to do with people that you love and you care about. It's easy to accept that someone you love and care about might be able to teach you something, and you can treat them that way and listen to them. But what if it's someone that you don't really like? What if it's someone you don't agree with or you constantly battle with? How it becomes hard. How do you treat someone like that? And to some extent, this is the battle that the Pharisees are having. Here's someone they don't really want to see his point of view. It seems that yeah, maybe if they had the humility to listen to the man about who Jesus was, their journey towards spiritual blindness could have been reversed. But it is also easy to look back on these, and I'm guilty of this, looking back at the Pharisees, how are these guys so dumb? How are they doing this, Or you think of like Simon Peter, denying Christ 3 times. It's like, what's he doing? But the longer I've been Christian, the more I realise it could have been me. And it's something we can all fall trapped to, I think. And I think back to my younger days, not that I was ever that rebellious, but as a teenager thinking you know everything and arguing with my parents. And remember one specific time, I wish I could give details, but I honestly don't remember the details. I just remember that there was some particular disagreement. It turned out I was right, and my parents were wrong. And something should have changed because of that. That would be the logical thing. And I thought, I'm right. This should change now. But what my dad did was, it taught me a lot. He was like, yep, you're right. But nothing's going to change. You're not going to get what you want. You're right, but that's it. And my heart's in the wrong place. I'm just, all I want to do is be right. My attitude is like, I want to win this, and it took me now I see, looking back, that's the beginning of that point where you just grow out of that rebellious stage of life where you think you know better than nearly everybody else. And you realise that other people have something to teach you. And I realised my dad taught me a great thing in that moment and changes your attitude to being, oh, well, maybe there's more I can learn. Maybe I haven't maybe they weren't just here to teach me how to grow up from being a child. Everyone I meet has something to teach me. And I can even think of occasions in my job where I know I've had them. I can't think of specific ones, but we have apprentices come through beneath me, and we do things a certain way. We trying to work efficiently, trying to get the job done, and then you see an apprentice doing something differently when you've showed them to do it the way you said. And you're like, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing it? Why are you doing it like that? And then you have another closer look, and you're like, oh, that's better. That's a better way to do it. And then it changes the way we all do it. It's just like, well, sometimes you just got to have that humility to realise that you don't know it all, and that God can work through anyone to teach you something. You just have to be able to let go of your pride and your prejudices and your preferences, and people can teach you things in ways you never knew. So that's what I've learned anyway. And it also makes me think of in Mark 12 where Jesus is asked what are the 2 greatest commandments, and one of them he says is to love your neighbour as yourself. And to me, this kind of thing is just critical to being able to treat others how I'd want to be treated. Like, even just for the fact that you'll be a better listener, and that someone will be loved for being listened to, but also that I can grow out of knowing that person, that they've got something to teach me, and by having that attitude, they're loved in that moment. So, yeah. Now, as I bring it to a close this morning, I want to look at this last part of chapter 9, which Cherry read towards the end of the chapter. We see the man who was born blind interact with Jesus, and we see the full restoration of his sight, not just physically, but spiritually. Verse 35, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now you say we see, your guilt remains." So his journey of having his sight restored is complete. He can see physically, and now he can see who Jesus is. And through this passage in this chapter, we've seen the 3 points we've talked about. This man has done those things. He's listened to Jesus directly. Even though he's presented with other points of view to try and convince him otherwise, he's listened to the direct words of Jesus, and his life's changed forever. And more to that point, even though he's pressured by the Pharisees to agree with them, he would not accept their attempts to intimidate and convince him that Jesus wasn't from God. He was focused on what mattered, and he was given a glimpse of who Jesus is, and he couldn't look away. And the same applies to us. I know when I started coming to this church back in 2010, my then girlfriend, Sarah, I wasn't Christian. I came because I was invited and I was respectful, and I came and just kept coming, sometimes just being polite, and then sometimes I just kept hearing things, You'd hear little things and perk your interest and be like, oh, and change your mind about something little, and there'd be something else, and it sort of snowballs. But, I kept coming for 2 years before I became Christian. And I look back and I think, I kind of did these things. Like if I found what I was hearing about Jesus was too hard, I'd find another source to go. I wouldn't listen to him directly. I'd listen indirectly to Jesus. I'd find some other way to hear about him. So it just made me feel a bit more comfortable. Like I don't want to have to flip my life upside down. So I'll just look at what I want to look at. Or, I'll find little irrelevant details to say, it can't be quite right because there's this little thing here. It's not anything to do with the resurrection or important things, but here's this little thing. And I can just go, oh, no, don't have to worry about the rest. Or even, it's not even something you do necessarily in person, but even the way you think about those, that you see other Christians, and it's easy to go, I don't want to be one of them. I don't want to, I don't want to do that when you're in that step, you haven't become Christian yet. That's how I allowed it to be 2 years before I finally, became Christian. To me, it came down to a question of about why did Jesus have to die the way he did? I had these doubts about, why did it have to be specifically a crucifixion? Why is it you're going to save the whole of humanity? Why is it? It seems strange. That's the way it has to be. I met with Pastor Andrew, and he guided me through how there were prophecies and all these important things that led to that, and why it had to be that way. And it got to a point where you realise I had no reasons left anymore. I'd seen enough, and the doubts I'd had been satisfied, and I became Christian and gave my life to Christ. It wasn't super dramatic, and it just became a point where I was like, I can't keep asking for more. I've seen enough. I've been given reasons to believe. Now I believe. And after that, it just became clear I just delayed it unnecessarily. I kept my focus on certain things and kept hold of pride and preferences and whatever made me feel more comfortable. So I guess I'd say this morning, don't do that. Don't be me. Don't just hold on to comfort. Don't develop tunnel vision. Don't be like us on the grinders and just focusing on this little thing that you're doing when there's a way bigger picture. Even though you might be in your comfort zone doing that, there's a fire coming up behind you. You want to know what's going on. And don't be like the Pharisees, and don't let your pride get in the way, or your comfort zone rob you of knowing who Jesus truly is, because your life will be forever better for it.
We hope you've enjoyed this message. If you'd like to know more about our church or would like to connect with someone, please contact us through our website